Well, one particular type of vehicle that I have a soft spot for are large personal style luxury coupes. And this 1971 Eldorado fits the bill. It's certainly large and it's certainly luxury. You can't buy a vehicle like this that just screams money when you pull up to your friend's front door. It just doesn't exist anymore. Yeah, sure, there's the Escalade and there's the Navigator and there's the Mercedes G-Wagon, but they just do not connote luxury like this massive 1971 Eldorado does. And this particular 1971 Eldorado I wanted to showcase because it's finished in my favorite color for this particular model year, and that is Empire Maroon. I think it's just a fabulous color with a black vinyl top and black interior. Now let's talk a little bit about this 1971 Eldorado because this was the first year for the revised second generation front wheel drive Eldorado that came on the heels of the 1967 to 70 Eldorado. And the wheelbase did stretch by a little over 6 inches. The 71 Eldorado rides atop a wheelbase that's a little bit over 126 inches compared to 120 inches for the previous generation Eldorado. But amazingly, these vehicles, the 1967 to 70 generation and the 1971, are almost identical in overall length, both about 220 inches. There's less than an inch difference between them. And yet, just because of the styling, the 1971 Eldorado, I would say, physically looks much larger and imposing because of, well, a number of elements that we're going to talk about. But as we start on the front of this vehicle, you can see that the 71 Eldorado took some of those cues from the 67 to 70 and then developed them a bit more. Of course, you have the so-called power dome hood here, but it's even more extreme in its proportions. It's more power domey, I guess we could say. And the 71 Eldorado added a new feature, which is that beveled theme that you can see on the hood that continues at the leading edge of the crease, the first crease, I should say, that starts on the hood. And then there's a second crease, and between those two creases is this beveled area that I've pointed out with the arrow. And this beveled theme was unique to the Eldorado. It was not found on the DeVille series or the Calais or the Fleetwood. It was unique to the Eldorado in both the front as well as the rear. We'll also point out a couple other things up front here in addition to that beveled theme. You'll notice that we have the quad headlamps that are exposed. Nothing new there. Cadillac had gone to exposed headlamps on the 69 Eldorado, continued here. But look at that very, let's say, expensive looking bumper and its form. This is actually a 7-piece bumper if you count the 2 bumper guards. It's 2 bumper guards and then 5 additional pieces to make this rather complicated shape. And interestingly, the center portion of that bumper bar there was also shared with the DeVille and the Fleetwood series as well as the Calais. Now, what did that mean? It's not necessarily that easy to share that bumper center bar because it means that the hoods have to have the same amount of plan view, or looking from a bird's eye view above, they have to have that same kind of V shape in order for the bumper bar to work. But nobody really ever noticed that because the Eldorado just looked different, had that beveled theme, and the designers were able to reuse that bumper bar in the center. I also point out that the 71 Eldorado is missing a few things that the 72 would get. Little eyebrows over the headlamps, kind of a little eyebrow over the grille, little finishing details that I don't know that they added necessarily something to the front end. I tend to like the 71 Eldorado. The 72 would also get the wheel covers that were really designed to come in the car in the first place, these kind of concentric ring wheel covers. The 71 had to make do with carryover wheel covers. I guess for whatever reason, they just weren't ready in time. Now, as we rotate around the side of the vehicle and here the front three-quarter view, you can see a key theme of the 1971 Eldorado, and that is of the so-called four-fendered look. And what do I mean by that? Well, clearly you have the front fenders on either side, so you have 2 fenders with distinct forms, and made even more distinct by the fact that there's that lower portion, or that lower surface in between the top of the fender and the top of the hood, the so-called catwalk area. And if you look out back, you're going to see this little trim piece behind the door. And if you look, there's a crease on the top side of that as well as the lower side of that. And that kind of forms a second series of fenders. Now, the designers arguably wanted to make that more prominent, but this car was already 80 inches wide, and if the car got wider than that, well, it would have to have oversized low running lights as it was driving down the roadway. So that just wasn't going to be a possibility. And for this generation Eldorado, there was less specific content on this particular vehicle in the 1967 to 70 generation. And this vehicle employed the same A-pillars, front glass, windshield as an example, from the full-size General Motors vehicles of the day. So while the designers perhaps wanted to make those fender forms even more prominent, you just couldn't when the constraints of those A-pillars, and given how wide they were with the wraparound glass, you just couldn't make the body of the car much wider without, let's say, pushing past that 80-inch limit that I previously mentioned. By the way, that little trim piece behind the door harkened back to Cadillacs of the 1950s where something similar was there. So the designers actually kind of set up the four-fender theme by using a trim piece that was reminiscent of Cadillac's past. One other little bit of trivia I will mention is that take a look at the size of the hood here. It's absolutely massive. This is amazingly a single-piece hood stamping on the inner and outer side, whereas the 1967 to 70 Eldorado used a two-piece stamping. Apparently, GM engineers were able to make this work and save themselves a few dollars from metal finishing the area in front of the molding in the center of the hood as well as behind it. Now, as we rotate to the rear of the vehicle, we see a number of things. One, again, take a look at that rear fender, I'll call it, that is set up by that trim piece behind the front door. You can really see it from this view. I think it's a graceful looking accent to the quarter panel. You also notice the deck lid louvers. This was something that was offered only on 1971 General Motors vehicles for the flow-through ventilation system before they would be relocated into the lock pillar in the doors, which was a much better location. This one trapped leaves and debris and water, and well, that's not great. The water had to flow through the louvers, through the deck lid, and then come out little holes in the bottom sides of it. So if it were wintertime and you went through a car wash, that water would freeze, and then you might freeze your deck lid closed. And yes, people in the Midwest do go through car washes when the weather is below freezing because the car wash is heated and their cars are full of salt and they look terrible. So don't say that people shouldn't go through car washes when it's cold outside, because they do here in the Midwest. Trust me. And on top of that, you can see on the deck lid, you have that bevel theme, remember, that we were talking about on the hood, repeated in the deck. So it actually kind of ties the car together, front and rear. I do like that this has that beveled surface, and then it has kind of this surface that is protruding on the rear side of the deck that goes down into the bumper. So the bumper completes the overall form, something that would go away when the bumper standards would come in. You'll also notice some styling departures from the 67 to 70 Eldorado, namely the skirted rear wheels. The 67 to 70 Eldorado did not have skirted rear wheels. There is no V'd backlight here. This is just kind of a more typical backlight on the car, probably a cost savings move. And then, of course, you have the opera window that is on the side there behind the front door glass. Now, this was a last-minute addition. This car was originally going to have hardtop styling, but the thought here was that by putting the opera window, GM could set up what was going to come on the 1973 Monte Carlo so that people would think that the Monte Carlo was kind of a mini Eldorado. So that was a last-minute change that was pushed through on this Eldorado, and I actually think it's an unfortunate change. It doesn't look bad, but the car would have looked better with hardtop styling and a movable rear quarter glass. And I think it's kind of unfortunate that GM's design brass elected to make that change, but that's what they did. Now, looking at the dead-on rear view, this is a view that I especially enjoy on this Eldorado because it just shows how wide this car is. This car looks immensely wide, and I do love the beveled theme on the deck. I like how the top of the quarter has a kind of peak, as well as the deck has this peak to it, and then in between there's a little valley, gives it some dimension. There's a shoulder that kind of comes from the C-pillar area and then tapers nicely inward, almost a little bit of a boat tail theme if you chopped off the boat tail where it has its point. so to speak. And that, again, was very popular with General Motors designers during this time frame. Of course, the boat tail Riviera would be something that they would come out with from 1971 to 1973. And I love how that form of the deck lid has continued on into the bumper. That was done on some other cars of the era, like the 72 Mark IV and 73 Mark IV, before the bumper standards would change. This is one of the few cars that has quite a few vertical cues, like the tail lamps, but it just looks wide. It looks immensely wide. And I think part of it is because of how this deck tapers down at the rear. Bill Mitchell, who was GM's design vice president, loved cars with tapered rears. And I think by tapering the rear, you're just accentuating the width of this vehicle visually. And of course, you have this large bumper that takes away from the visual height too, because it's just reflecting the ground. So the overall effect is that you're looking at a vehicle that just appears to be large and wide and intimidating. Now, as we go to the interior of this particular vehicle, this is one of the areas where I think it's kind of a letdown, I would say, just in the overall material quality. Not necessarily the theme, but the way that this car is put together in the interior, I think, is just subpar. Now, this is a lower option Eldorado because it has only the two-way power seat, which was standard. You can see there's not six-way controls on the bottom of the seat there, and there's not even the automatic seat back release. There's a latching mechanism that's on the seat back to enable the seat to move forward. One cool thing, though, is that these cars have a 3-speed wiper and wiper control that's mounted on the door. You can see it there on the driver's door panel. They do have these very thin and dainty pull straps that look dainty and are, especially as the doors on these cars tended to sag. People would yank on the pull straps and they would pull out. GM would issue a technical service bulletin to fix that enabled the technicians, or basically encouraged them, to drill holes through the escutcheon plates on the door handles, and that would help better secure the door straps to the door panel. And here's a better look at that door panel, what I'm talking about. You can see that the pull straps are relatively dainty on these. In 1973, Cadillac would overcorrect and have these big mounting brackets and a much thicker pull strap, perhaps just to convey that they had fixed this issue. But for some reason, it appears this particular car, its door pull straps have held together, which is very rare for a coupe. I don't necessarily like that faux wood grain. I don't think it's convincing. GM, I think during this era, had some of the worst faux wood grain. Ford had some actually pretty convincing faux wood grain. And here we have one last look at the interior and the seats. This was during the era that Cadillac had these high back seats that they introduced around 1969 in their vehicles, really for safety. And some people liked them, some people didn't. It made the interior, if you're sitting in the back, feel a bit more claustrophobic. Some ladies didn't like them and how their ponytails would hit the headrest, but it was well intentioned. And you'll also notice this car has a flat floor because the Eldorado, of course, is front-wheel drive. And speaking of front-wheel drive, here we have the massive 8.2-liter 500 cubic inch V8 under hood in this Eldorado. This would be the second year for the 500 cubic inch V8. It was introduced in 1970 and was an Eldorado exclusive during this time frame. Otherwise, if you get a different Cadillac, you get the 472 cubic inch 7.7-liter V8. This made 365 gross horsepower. In 1970, it made 400 gross horsepower. The difference really was that in 1971, this engine was now a low compression engine and had to run on low lead or unleaded fuel. That was a General Motors edict at the time and was really spurred by emission standards. Now notice somebody has painted the valve covers the wrong color. If you look at the alternator bracket, you'll see the correct deeper Cadillac blue on here. And unfortunately, that's, I don't know, just for whatever reason, hard to replicate. I don't know if they just don't mix the right paint, but I don't think I've really seen somebody who's resprayed their engine attempting to make the Cadillac blue really make it look convincing versus the original factory color. Now, of course, you can see that the air conditioning compressor, the big A6 Frigidaire compressor, is in the middle of the V here. That was typical of Cadillacs. That was something they had done on the previous generation V8s as well. And that was because the air conditioning was operating all the time with automatic climate control, or almost all the time. And so Cadillac didn't want to put it on an accessory bracket further out, which would enable it to have more noise and vibration. And I will say that these 500 cubic inch V8s or the 472s are just especially smooth engines overall, very reliable, very durable. Other GM engines, you tend to have, let's say, water pump issues or some other minor things, but these Cadillac V8s are, I would say, top-notch in terms of being bulletproof. They're not race engines, they're not four-bolt mains or anything like that, but they are very durable and they run extremely well and smoothly. Let's close out with a look underneath because there's a number of interesting features here. The first is the Eldorado had torsion bar front suspension. You can see the two big, long, longitudinal torsion bars that are mounted to a cross member across the frame. This would have been similar to the 67 to 70 Eldorado. Of course, by this point, though, there were coil springs in the rear as opposed to the leaf spring rear setup that the 67 to 70 Eldorado had, and also this vehicle has a full perimeter frame. The previous generation Eldorado just had a 3/4 length frame that terminated ahead of the leaf shackles. Now you also will see something strange here, and that's a power steering line, I believe, that you can see the rubber portion, I'll point it out with the arrow, and then this metal line just kind of snakes around on the underside here. My thought is that Cadillac was trying to cost out a power steering cooler, and they thought, well, this is going to get some airflow underneath the car, and if you make this metal line longer, it'll perhaps just cool off on its own as opposed to needing the cooler. I can't think of any other reason why this line snakes around so much on the vehicle. One other little bit of trivia, there actually are 2 oil drain plugs on these front-wheel drive Eldorados. There's one in the typical location, and then there's another one ahead of it. And a little bit of oil comes out of that second one, not a heck of a lot, maybe half a quart or something like that. But if you want to do the complete oil change, do both. I doubt many quick change lubes or whatever they had back in the day would execute upon that. And that is the story of this beautiful Empire Maroon 1971 Eldorado. Let me know what you think. Put a comment in the comment section. Is this your favorite color too? And until next time, take care.